On the 18th of January 1919, Charlotte Bill lifted the telephone at Wood Farm. The nursery nurse was known in the royal household as Lala. The youngest son of King George and Queen Mary had lived his final years in her care there. Prince John had suffered another seizure. The 13-year-old boy had not recovered. The woman who sent the message was not his mother. She was the woman who had stayed. Queen Mary opened her private journal and recorded the message. She and the king went to Wood Farm, entered the room, and found their son lying peacefully. The queen then noted what the official announcement omitted. Lala was resigned, she wrote, but heartbroken. The line places the nurse at the center of the family's worst news. These women raised Britain's most famous children, then discovered what they could carry away. 77 years earlier, another trusted nursery woman had returned her keys before leaving a queen. Subscribe to Dynasty and Dust for more. Why had John been moved to a farmhouse? And why did another royal nursery woman return her keys? That morning, on the 30th of September, 1842, Louise Lehzen prepared to leave Windsor. For almost a quarter of a century, she had occupied the most sensitive position in Princess Victoria's life. She had watched the child, taught the girl, defended the heir, and followed the young queen into the center of the court. Now a carriage waited to take her away. Before she entered it, she returned the objects that made the separation official. Lehzen carried keys that opened the private rooms around the sovereign. Each key stood for entry to a private room without an invitation. She had possessed that access when Victoria was a guarded child. She kept it when the child became queen. From then on, the keys could no longer travel with her. The woman surrendering them had once been chosen because she seemed safe. Louise Lehzen was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor from Hanover. She entered the household of Victoria's parents as a governess to the older Princess Feodora, then remained for the infant Victoria. The assignment carried no promise that she would become powerful. It began with lessons, clothes, meals, sleep, and the long repetition through which a child decides whom to trust. Victoria's father died before the girl was a year old. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, depended increasingly on Sir John Conroy, an ambitious officer who managed her household. Together, they imposed what became known as the Kensington System. Victoria slept in her mother's chamber. She was kept apart from most other children. Her movements were supervised, her circle narrowed, and her days arranged so that independence would be difficult to practice. Lehzen lived inside that arrangement, but she did not belong to Conroy. The young princess could speak to her when a guarded corridor offered no privacy. Lehzen carried messages, kept watch, and made loyalty visible in small acts the household could not easily forbid. Victoria later remembered a lonely childhood. In that loneliness, the governess became the adult whose presence did not depend on the Duchess's approval at every moment. The pressure became unmistakable in 1835, when Victoria was ill at Ramsgate. Conroy wanted the teenage heir to sign a document that would make him her personal secretary when she became queen. The title sounded administrative. The effect would have been control over access, papers, and patronage at the opening of a new reign. Victoria refused. Lehzen supported the refusal while the girl was sick, isolated, and being pressed by adults who controlled the chamber. 2 years later, shortly after dawn on the 20th of June, 1837, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace. King William was dead. Victoria was queen. She left her mother's chamber and received the visitors unaccompanied. The physical separation mattered because Conroy's system had been designed to prevent exactly that sort of independent action. Lehzen had helped the girl reach the entrance. She could not decide what happened after Victoria crossed it. Victoria asked to remain by herself for a short interval, a request the Kensington routine had rarely granted. She then informed the household that she would occupy a chamber apart from her mother. Beds, entrances, and assembled courtiers changed position around the 18-year-old queen. Conroy had expected to manage the opening of the reign. Instead, he watched the young woman he had tried to bind begin choosing who could enter. The new queen brought Lehzen into the royal household. She gave her a title, Baroness, and kept her close without assigning a neat official office equal to her influence. Lehzen knew the rhythms of Victoria's private day and the names behind old fears. She could enter spaces barred to most courtiers. The access that had protected a child now surrounded a sovereign, and that made it valuable to anyone who wanted the new court arranged differently. Lehzen's reach was practical as well as emotional. She dealt with Victoria's clothes and jewels, watched personal expenses, and handled papers that placed personal life next to money. Her apartments adjoined the Queen's, with a connecting entrance between them. The keys in her keeping were therefore not a decorative reward. They made her part of the machinery that decided which servant, bill, message, or visitor reached the sovereign. That machinery had grown around a relationship formed before Victoria possessed a chamber assigned to her. Court rank had not created Lehzen's authority, so court rank could not describe its limit. A minister could be dismissed from an office everyone understood. Removing the former governess meant separating memory, access, household care, and affection without an official post that contained them. When Prince Albert married Victoria in 1840, the household gained another person who loved the Queen and expected to shape her private life. Albert entered as a husband without a settled political role. He could not simply command the government, but he could seek order in the palace, accounts, servants, and nursery. Lehzen occupied the same private ground through memory and habit. Neither relationship was false. Their claims could still collide. The birth of Victoria and Albert's first child turned that collision into a question no palace could leave vague. The baby was also named Victoria. She was a daughter, a royal heir, and the center of a new nursery. The older queen trusted the woman who had guarded her own childhood. Albert believed parents, not a former governess, had to govern their child's household. On the 28th of February, 1841, Victoria and Albert signed a nursery regulation. Across 3 manuscript pages, it set out the superintendent's responsibilities and told the other nursery staff to obey her. It named the wet nurse, Mrs. Ratsey, the nurse, Mrs. Roberts, and the nursery maid, Charlotte Whiting. The royal parents had turned personal authority into written orders carried out by named women. Lehzen did not cease to matter when the ink dried. She remained close to the Queen, and the nursery continued to operate through people whose loyalties did not fit cleanly on paper. Later that year, the infant Princess Royal became ill. Arguments followed over food, treatment, attendance, and responsibility. Albert saw negligence and a disorderly system protected by Lehzen. Victoria heard an attack on the woman whose judgment she had trusted, when nearly every other adult had tried to control her. The child's illness forced a choice that affection had postponed. Albert pressed for command of the nursery and for Lehzen's removal from daily power. Victoria resisted, then yielded. The decision was presented as retirement for health, with an income that allowed Lehzen to live in comfort in Germany. Money softened the fall. It did not alter the direction of the carriage. At Windsor, Victoria wept. Lehzen left with a pension, a portrait, and the knowledge that the child she had protected was now the queen who had agreed to her departure. Victoria's surviving letters preserve what office could not. She continued to write with warmth and affection. Lehzen could still be loved at a distance. She could not reopen the chambers that the returned keys had closed. Lehzen did not ask Victoria to endure a spoken farewell. She left a letter and slipped away before the Queen had to watch the carriage depart. The next morning, Victoria woke and remembered that the woman who had been present through nearly all her conscious life was really gone. A retirement announced for health had changed the first sound and movement of the Queen's day. Victoria's journal caught the conflict inside the farewell. Being spared the embrace made the departure easier in one sense and more painful in another. She could accept that leaving was wisest for Lehzen and still regret that the final movement had already happened before she knew. The Queen who controlled a court had been denied the last choice in a relationship that began when she controlled almost nothing. Years later, in Bückeburg, Lehzen lived on the pension Victoria provided. She placed royal portraits around her home, answered the Queen's letters, and received private visits when Victoria traveled in Germany. The relationship survived as correspondence and memory. No letter restored a place in the nursery. No portrait opened a palace door. In the end, she never again held those keys. Victoria visited her privately in Germany in 1845, then again in 1862 after Albert's death. The second meeting placed the two surviving women on the far side of the household struggle that had separated them. Victoria recorded that age had changed Lehzen, and that both were moved by seeing one another. When Lehzen died in 1870, Victoria ordered a memorial for her grave. She wrote that she owed the former governess much, and that Lehzen had adored her. The sovereign could decide how loyalty would be remembered after death. During Lehzen's life, she had not restored the surrendered keys. Half a century later, another nursery woman faced the same divide without a title, a royal pension, or a queen's power to keep writing. On the 2nd of November, 1891, Elizabeth Everest wrote to the boy who called her Woom. She asked him to favor her with a few lines, and worried that absence might make him forget. At the foot of the page, she drew what she called a photograph of herself in ink. The little self-portrait turned the usual direction of nursery memory around. Everest did not depend on a family photographer to include her beside a child. She placed her face in the correspondence. Winston's separate letters to her ended with extravagant affection, including the promise of 100,000 kisses. The boy could fill a page with love. He could not sign her hiring paper. Elizabeth Everest had entered the Churchill household when Winston was still an infant. The family hired her in 1875, months after Winston's birth at Blenheim Palace. He would later remember grand rooms, famous parents, and a childhood full of frustrated appeals. The person who answered the ordinary appeals was Everest. The Mrs. before her name was a courtesy. Everest was unmarried. She entered the record not through a husband or a personal title, but through the care she provided another family. That made the nursery bond unusually visible and her legal position unusually thin. The children could use family names for her. The decision still belonged to their parents. When Lord Randolph Churchill went to Dublin as personal secretary to Winston's grandfather, the new Viceroy of Ireland, Everest traveled with the household. The baby crossed the Irish Sea inside a family procession shaped by politics. Everest crossed as the person responsible for keeping him fed, dressed, occupied, and calm, while the adults entered public salons. The move gave her no claim on the family's rank. It gave the child longer stretches in her company. Winston struggled to pronounce woman and turned Everest into Woom, Woomany, and The nursery names survived because the relationship survived the nursery. She began his early reading and writing before a governess arrived. She took him walking, gathered flowers, chased butterflies with him, and stopped his small experiments in cruelty. When the 8-year-old Winston wanted to kill a snake they found in the grass, Everest made him let it crawl away. The surviving nursery letters put Winston's dependence in his own hand. He asked for Everest when he was away, told her what had happened, and signed his affection with 100,000 kisses. His letters to his parents often asked them to send the person who made another place feel like home. His younger brother, Jack, joined the nursery in 1880. Everest now moved between 2 boys, 2 sets of clothes, 2 illnesses, and the shifting demands of parents whose public lives carried them elsewhere. Winston could resent a rule she enforced and still seek her first when frightened. The bond rested on her return. In March 1886, pneumonia carried that dependence into danger. 11-year-old Winston developed a high fever. His pulse raced, one lung struggled, and the doctor warned Lady Randolph that the other was taking the strain. Nurses watched him without pause. Everest remained beyond the sick room until the doctor admitted her. The doctor feared that seeing her would excite Winston so much that his condition might worsen. Winston wrote that he felt weak and close to tears. Everest awaited news while other nurses crossed the sick room. Medical caution had turned attachment into a risk the household had to manage. He recovered, returned to school, and grew old enough to notice what other boys thought. At Harrow, he sometimes worried that appearing with his former nanny would look babyish. The pressure came from boys policing one another's independence. Then a speech day arrived, and neither parent came. Everest did. Winston met her, took her arm, and walked with her through the town while schoolboys laughed. He did not release her to satisfy them. Everest also carried a kind of authority that Winston did not always welcome. When he wrote to his mother asking for money, she added her own warning that giving it to him was unwise. Later, when he wanted a bulldog while his bicycle remained broken, she pressed for the repair. The bicycle returned to use. The bulldog did not arrive. Her authority could stop a purchase only while the household tolerated it. It could not secure her job. By 1891, Winston was approaching 17, and Jack no longer needed a nursery in the old form. The family saw a position the boys had outgrown. Winston saw the person who had carried continuity through his childhood. He learned that Everest was to leave the family's employ and protested. The immediate solution moved her sideways rather than sending her away. She went to the home of his grandmother, the Duchess of Marlborough, known in the family as Duchess Fanny, and became housekeeper. Winston and Jack could still visit. The title changed, the household changed, and the separation was postponed. In November 1891, the letter with the little ink portrait traveled between them during this altered life. Everest's question about being out of sight was therefore more than a sentimental phrase. She had already been moved out of the nursery that defined their daily life. A reply from Winston could reassure her that the relationship survived, but it could not tell her how long the grandmother's household would keep paying her. 2 years passed. The grandmother's household decided it no longer required Everest either. Winston heard that she might be dismissed and wrote to his mother. He admitted that intervening might expose him to anger, then did it anyway. He called the proposed act cruel and rather mean. He warned that a woman who had served the family through his childhood was about to be cut adrift at an age when beginning again would be hard. Lady Randolph did not secure another lasting post. The dismissal arrived in a letter. Her service ended through paper delivered, when the children she had raised possessed no authority to reverse it. The household controlled both Everest's dismissal and the references on which her next employment depended. Everest moved to Crouch End in North London. Winston was beginning military life and had little money beside the scale of his family name, but he began sending what money he could. From then on, his payments met each bill. The transfer reversed their old positions. She had once met his daily needs from wages the family paid. Now he tried to meet hers from income he controlled. Winston's payments covered bills and kept correspondence moving, but they could not restore her former post or lodging. Less than 2 years after her departure, Everest's health deteriorated. In July 1895, a telegram reached Winston at his barracks. Her state was critical. The young cavalry officer left and hurried to North London. The family roll had vanished from paper, but the old message remained effective. Woom needed him, and he went. He reached her and stayed through that night. At 2:15 on the morning of the 3rd of July, Elizabeth Everest died. She was outside the Churchill household, without a husband or child beside her. The man she had raised stood close enough to witness the final moments. Winston and Jack took responsibility for the funeral. They arranged the burial and placed a headstone over her grave. The act carried no grand family ceremony. It was 2 former nursery boys making a public marker for a woman the family had released from its employ. Winston later paid a florist to tend the grave, turning remembrance into a repeated transaction rather than a single speech. On the day Everest died, Winston wrote to his mother that he had not realized how much Woom had been to him. The sentence arrived too late to change her former post, her funds, or the chamber in which she died. It did change the written record from a story of childhood affection into an adult acknowledgement of loss. Years later, Winston read an older historian's tribute to the nurse who had sustained his own childhood. He decided that the words belonged on Everest's grave. The borrowed epitaph made a private carer part of the reason a public life had been possible, but it still spoke through the man she had raised. Her photograph traveled farther than her position ever had. Years later, at Chartwell, A small, red-framed image of Everest stood among photographs of Winston's wife and children near the place where he worked. He described her as his dearest and most intimate friend. The household had removed her place, but it could not make the child forget who had stayed. Unlike Lehzen, Everest had neither title, royal pension, nor continuing palace access. Years later, her name survived, but her former place never returned. By the year Everest died, Charlotte Bill was 20 years old. She would soon enter a nursery where photographs, diaries, and court calendars seemed able to preserve every important person. Her career would bring her beside 6 royal children and place her closest to the one least able to protect her position. Before she sent the Wood Farm telephone message, she first had to decide whether to speak about what another nurse was doing beyond the screened nursery entrance. Later biographies of the royal nursery describe the decision this way. Charlotte Bill had entered the household of the Duke and Duchess of York as an under-nurse. She saw the senior nurse treat the children harshly and fail to care properly for the second son, Albert. Bill carried the concern beyond the nursery. In 1897, the senior nurse left, and Charlotte Bill took the leading place. Speaking created its own risk. The senior nurse had arrived with a respectable reference from another aristocratic household. Bill was the junior woman, challenging both that reference and the privacy of the nursery. If the parents dismissed the warning, she could lose her place while the children remained behind the same door. Instead, the report altered who held authority beside them. The episode gave Bill an early lesson in the weakness of household testimony. A written reference could open a prestigious nursery even when daily conduct later contradicted it. Someone inside the room still had to act on what the paper had failed to reveal. Charlotte Bill entered the York nursery in the 1890s as an under-nurse. Her promotion gave her responsibility for children, whose ordinary movements would later become national memory. David, the future Edward VIII, was followed by Albert, the future George VI. Princess Mary, Prince Henry, and Prince George joined them. Bill dressed children, who would stand in uniforms and jewels as adults. The nursery first knew them as bodies that woke, cried, resisted food, and needed someone to return at night. The Royal Collection photographs place Bill beside those children before public memory separated them into kings, dukes, and princesses. In one image from October 1900, she sits with the infant Prince Henry. The camera makes the hierarchy obvious. The child is named in the royal record. The woman is identified by surname and nursery title, yet she is the adult holding the stillness required for the picture. The family called her Lala. The name traveled from one child to the next, turning Charlotte Bill into a repeated figure through a nursery that kept changing occupants. A new baby arrived. An older child moved to tutors, and Bill remained close to the earliest routines. She could recognize the beginning of an illness before a court circular had anything to report. On the 12th of July, 1905, the 6th child was born at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate. He was named John. His father recorded the birth and worried over the responsibility of now having 5 sons. For Bill, the addition meant another infant placed inside an already crowded sequence of meals, clothes, outings, and sleep. John was not born as the secluded figure later retellings would make him. He joined family photographs and nursery life. His parents saw him. His siblings played with him, and his grandmother, Queen Alexandra, took pleasure in him. Bill cared for him within that movement before any diagnosis narrowed the places he could safely go. When John was about 4, seizures made the danger visible. A seizure could begin without the courtesy of a timetable. A child who seemed well could fall, stiffen, lose awareness, and need protection from his surroundings. Bill learned to clear the immediate area, endure the attack, and watch the slow return. Each recovery left the question of the next one unanswered. The household could arrange servants, journeys, and official appearances. It could not command the seizure to hold until seclusion. As John's brothers grew into public roles, the youngest child became harder to fit inside ceremonies whose cadence and appearance mattered. Bill's care shifted from ordinary nursery repetition toward constant readiness. In 1910, John's father became King George V. The family name, residences, and obligations changed around the children. John was now a son of the sovereign, but the new rank did not change his illness. It increased the number of eyes for whom the household might try to manage it. Doctors examined him. Tutors tried to teach him. His progress did not follow that of his siblings, and the seizures grew more serious. Formal lessons eventually ended. Bill stayed with the parts of the day that no tutor could make orderly. She took him outside when he was able, sat through recovery when he was not, and carried knowledge that came from watching rather than testing. Royal history has often described John as the hidden prince. The phrase is memorable because it makes the household's choice sound complete. The surviving life is less tidy. John appeared with his family, received visits, played in the grounds, and joined them at Christmas. He was also moved farther from the settings where royal life was most visible. Both facts can be true at once. The First World War tightened the setting. The royal family remained at Sandringham for long stretches, while John's older brothers entered military worlds, and his parents carried public obligations. By 1916, his seizures had become frequent enough that Wood Farm offered a smaller and more controllable household on Sandringham land. John moved there. Charlotte Bill moved with him. Wood Farm stood away from the main royal house without standing outside the family's land. That distance solved several problems at once. A seizure could be managed away from a formal dinner or public guest. The boy could follow a simpler day. The household could say he remained near his parents. The person who absorbed the practical cost of that solution was Lala. Wood Farm changed the pattern. The family did not dismiss the nursery woman or send the child away from her. It moved them together. Bill became more necessary. At the same moment, both she and John became less visible. Their closeness deepened through a decision that placed the child at the estate's edge. Bill later explained that the attacks had become so disturbing that John could not safely remain with his brothers and sister when they occurred. The separation protected the other children from frightening scenes and gave John a quieter setting. It also meant that the worker who recognized the first signs of a seizure determined more of his ordinary world. John had his own quarters and a small household. Queen Alexandra arranged a garden that gave him a place to tend and explore. He rode in a pony cart, walked outdoors, and took pleasure in the natural world. Bill made those movements possible by judging when he was well enough to leave the house and how quickly she could bring him back. His grandmother noticed that he wanted a companion. Queen Mary departed from strict royal practice, and welcomed local children to visit. One was Winifred Thomas, a girl living with relatives connected to the Sandringham stables. Winifred and John walked, cycled, and tended the garden. Bill's care did not consist of keeping John apart. It included welcoming a child who could meet him without ceremony. John wrote short notes. He asked after injuries, sent affection, and left traces in a hand that did not resemble a court secretary's polished script. The notes matter because they return action to the boy. He was not only a condition managed by adults, he reached outward, invited, thanked, and remembered. The Royal Collection photographs place Bill beside the children she nursed, but Wood Farm gave her another form of proximity. A formal picture could be arranged and ended. A seizure could not. Bill knew the sound of the chamber before an attack and the depletion after it. She learned when John's wish to continue had to yield to the risk of another fall. His siblings visited. On one occasion, two older brothers took him for a run in a small pushcart and disappeared along the path. The scene resists the simplest version of abandonment. The brothers could arrive and create a burst of movement. Bill remained after they returned to their own lives. Queen Mary also visited and recorded concern for her youngest child. Her position was not emotionally empty, and Bill's presence did not require an uncaring mother. The sharper fact is structural. A queen could love her son and still rely on another woman to carry most of the unplanned hours. That reliance made Bill an insider to royal fear. She saw the attacks the public did not. She knew which family visit ended early, which journey was canceled, and which calm morning followed a dangerous night. Nothing required her to turn those hours into scandal. Their hidden value lay in the ordinary truth that the person with the least dynastic importance often possessed the most immediate knowledge. As the seizures worsened, the household had fewer choices that felt safe. A crowded family gathering could expose John to injury and distress his siblings. A lonely farmhouse could protect him while reducing the life open to him. Bill lived inside the compromise rather than choosing the balance. Christmas Day of 1918 brought John back into the family house. The war had ended only weeks earlier. The royal table gathered after years of anxiety, and the youngest child took his place for part of the day. That night, he returned to Wood Farm. The journey covered little distance on the estate. It marked the line between a family occasion and the household built around his condition. January followed with winter routines. Bill watched attacks become more frequent. She could not promise that the boy would reach adulthood, and doctors had warned the family that he might not. Each recovered morning, therefore, carried relief without security. At Wood Farm on the 18th of January 1919, Charlotte Bill waded through Prince John's final seizure. When the attack ended, the 13-year-old did not wake. Bill stayed with him, confirmed that the ordinary recovery was not coming, and went to the telephone. The message reached Queen Mary. Lala told her that John had died after one of his attacks. The Queen carried the news to King George, and they traveled to Wood Farm. The parents entered the chamber Bill had just left and found their son lying as if asleep. Queen Mary opened her private journal. She recorded the shock, the stillness of the child, and the relief she hoped death had brought from worsening illness. Then she recorded Lala. Bill was resigned but heartbroken. From then on, the private record carried Bill's grief beside John's death. The phrase does not turn a worker into the mother. It recognizes that the worker had her own place in the death scene. The royal announcement could tell the country that the king's youngest son had died. It did not need the telephone, the nurse beside him, or the order in which adults entered the chamber. The journal preserves that order. Bill knew first. Bill sent the message. The parents came. The personal household then converted the death into public fact. The news also moved through a family whose members had known different versions of John. Older siblings who had left the nursery years before did not possess Bill's recent knowledge of the attacks. Queen Mary had the authority to record the death and shape the mourning. Bill held the hours that explained why the final seizure was both a shock and the end of a long warning. 3 days later, John was buried at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene at Sandringham. Members of the royal household and local people were present. Queen Mary thanked the servants who had been faithful to him. Bill crossed from the small wood farm chamber into a funeral shaped by rank, but grief did not promote her into the family. The boy left her something more personal than a court acknowledgement. Bill kept a portrait of John and a short letter in which he wrote that he loved his nanny. The object did not supply a post or a bequest. It let the child's hand enter the account of what their relationship had been. Other keepsakes traveled along different family lines. Queen Mary gave John's companion, Winifred Thomas, several of his books, inscribed in his memory. Bill's portrait and letter remained with the woman who had carried the final routine. The distribution of small objects created a private memorial outside the royal tomb. When John's elder brother later entered Bill's home, the large picture above the mantel was the first object that caught his attention. Bill had arranged the room so that the child remained visible before the visitor could turn the conversation toward kings, wars, or abdication. In her house, John was not the least public royal son. He was the face over the fire. After the funeral, Wood Farm no longer needed a household organized around John's seizures. The quarters could be reassigned, the servants moved, and the special routine ended. Bill had cared so continuously that success offered no next assignment. The child she had kept safe was gone. Decades later, Bill's name remained in royal memory. Family members continued to know her, and visitors remembered John's portrait displayed prominently in her home. She lived until 1964. Decades later, the portrait remained after the child had died. The public version of Prince John repeatedly changed around her. One era treated him as a sad personal matter. Another called him lost and accused the family of concealing him. Drama gave him dialogue, color, and a place inside the fall of European courts. Bill's trace remained smaller and harder to sentimentalize. She sent the message and kept the portrait. The dynasty kept the date, and Charlotte Bill kept the child. Not his body, his title, or the power to decide where he lived. She kept the version of him formed through watched mornings, broken evenings, garden paths, and the words he had placed in her hand. Her outcome was not Lehzen's exile or Everest's dismissal. Bill stayed until the relationship ended through death. That difference matters because it reveals another limit. A nanny could avoid being sent away and still have her entire place vanish when the child did. Across the three households, the governing document changed. Lehzen returned keys after a signed nursery regulation redrew authority. Everest received a dismissal letter and depended on family references. Bill sent a telephone message and appeared in the Queen's personal diary. Each trace records a different way the household could end a nursery. None of those women entered the role with a professional certificate that belonged to her rather than the household. Skill lived in the family's memory, the child's affection, or a reference the household might write. A favorable outcome could still leave the woman unable to carry proof of what she had done into the next house. That absence had already troubled another woman while Charlotte Bill was beginning her nursery career. She was not attached to a palace, and no famous child would make her name. She kept a black notebook filled with meetings, cuttings, lists of possible supporters, and families asking for trained care before the first students had finished. On the 25th of September, 1892, Emily Ward opened the door at number 9 Norland Place. 5 probationers entered an institute built around a proposition Victorian critics found absurd. A nursery woman could be trained, examined, recorded, and placed as a professional. If Ward succeeded, the next family would not own the whole account of the worker who arrived. The scheme at that entrance had already failed once. 10 years earlier, in 1882, Emily Ward had tried to establish training for nursery nurses around the educational ideas of Friedrich Froebel. Her friends were campaigning to open universities, examinations, and professions to women. To some of them, asking an educated young woman to enter a nursery looked like a retreat into household care. The funds were not there, the support was weak, and Ward put the proposal aside. The first report of the Norland Institute, issued in 1895, preserved Ward's explanation. Her educational allies had treated the plan as a step backward for women, so she bided her time. She did not put away the problem. Ward had been educated by a governess and at a London boarding school. In her early 20s, she taught infants at Notting Hill High School. The youngest children were expected to fit an institution designed for older pupils. Ward asked the headmistress for a separate place where children could learn through movement, observation, handwork, and play before formal lessons closed around them. In 1876, at the age of 26, she opened Norland Place School with 5 children. 3 years later, the Froebel Society gave it a first-class commendation. Ward had proved that a classroom organized for small children could succeed. The unresolved question was who would carry that method into the family houses where most affluent children spent their earliest years. Ward had been preparing for that question since 1874, when she joined the group that became the Froebel Society. She took lectures in London and studied for a summer in Geneva with one of Froebel's prominent followers. By 1881, she was lecturing for the society and serving on its committee. The experience gave her an educational network, but it also exposed the dividing line that network drew. Teaching older girls looked like advancement. Training women to care for very young children still looked domestic. Ward's childhood supplied a quieter argument. She later wrote that many of the things she remembered most clearly had been learned through observation before the age of 8. A governess, a classroom, a walk, or an adult's familiar response could form knowledge before a textbook arrived. If that was true, the woman beside the nursery child was already teaching, whether the household respected the role or not. The gray volume on Ward's shelf offered one answer. It was a 3rd edition of Froebel's Mother's Songs. Games and Stories, purchased in 1877 and covered with use. Its pages treated play, touch, song, and observation as serious parts of development. Ward's sister used the copy while preparing an English translation. Pencil notes and question marks accumulated in the margins. The book was not decoration, it was being worked on. By 1892, Ward had a plan that could survive more than settled conviction. On the 14th of May, she began filling a black leather notebook with names, invitations, newspaper cuttings, and assignments. She listed society women who might provide a venue for a student, teach needlework or physiology, or help a candidate who could not pay. She listed families asking to appoint nurses who had not yet completed a single day of training. That list of inquiries changed the risk. Ward no longer had to persuade supporters that families might want a trained nurse. 4 notebook pages held prospective employers before the first certificate existed. What she needed was a way to turn interest into a school, and a school into a vocation a family could recognize. She held salon meetings through the summer and autumn. Influential women entered London houses to hear a proposal about the nursery. Head mistresses who had once feared that the idea was retrograde could now see employers assembling. Newspapers including The Lady, the Manchester Guardian, and the Daily Chronicle reported on the attempt. A nursery carer who had previously arrived through family acquaintance or an informal reference was being discussed as the member of a new profession. That morning, on the 25th of September, the argument became 5 names in a register: Flora Rivola, Constance Fox, Frances Furman, Christine Tisdall, and Ellen Cummingham enrolled as probationers. Each entered at number 9 Norland Place, with an education, an address, prior experience, and a decision to attach her future to an institution no household had yet tested. The 5 did not remain an isolated experiment for long. By the following year, the institute counted 46 members. Applications arrived from London and from counties across England, Wales, and Scotland. Most candidates were between 18 and 30, though one 15-year-old exception entered in 1893 and later became matron of Marlborough College. Admission required more than a family's claim that a daughter was suitable. Candidates faced a general knowledge examination. The register separated home education from private school, grammar school, teacher training, first aid, drawing, and needlework. It recorded earlier care of younger relatives beside paid experience. As a nursery governess, the page made different routes comparable before the women ever stood in the same training room. The word probationer mattered. Ward did not hand out a title at the entrance. The women had to be observed, assessed, and placed. The first black book recorded birth dates, home addresses, previous careers, education, first aid or teaching certificates, experience with children, needlework, musical ability, and later placements. A family could still decide whom to hire. It would no longer be the only party keeping the account. The register also exposed who could enter. Most of the early women came from professional, commercial, clerical, or landed families. Fathers appeared as solicitors, architects, clergymen, civil servants, merchants, bankers, or gentlemen. The form did not ask for a mother's profession. Training offered a new path to women, but the £36 fee kept the entrance narrow. Ward made the probationers visible before she could make them secure. Their morning or heavy work dress was striped pink and white. A blue silk dress was reserved for afternoons and formal appearances. Aprons, detachable collars, cuffs, ties, gloves, bonnets, and cloaks formed a uniform that separated the wearer from an ordinary maid in a household corridor. That separation was deliberate. Critics had said educated women would reject menial work. Ward answered by making the worker recognizable as a trained nurse. Yet recognition could cut two ways. The dress announced professional status, and it also announced that the wearer was always on duty under another institution's rules. Christine Tisdall was 18 when she put on that first uniform. Her slim testimonial book, bound in black leather with a gold-stamped cover, began recording her progress in December 1892. Ward judged her performance in hygiene, needlework, cookery, singing, storytelling, natural history, punctuality, neatness, tact, and temper. Some marks were good, some very good. No result was folded into a general promise that she was fond of children. The course moved from Norland's supervised classrooms into places where error carried a consequence. During residential training, probationers devoted their mornings to cookery, laundry, and household chores. Afternoons brought lectures, walks, kindergarten games, and needlework. They practiced the handling of children, the signs of illness, and the difference between a passing discomfort and a danger that required help. Hospital experience was harder to obtain. London matrons did not want outside trainees interfering with their own nurses. Ward had to send probationers to children's wards elsewhere in Britain. A hospital placement forced the young women to meet illness without the protection of one wealthy family's privacy. Afterward, a short quarantine kept any infection from traveling directly into their first nursery post. On the 10th of April, 1893, the matron at the Children's Convalescent Hospital in Bushey Heath entered Christine's second period assessments. The scores extended from very fair to excellent. The variation mattered. A sentimental reference might have praised devotion and stopped. The book preserved where a learner still had to improve. Christine then entered a family in Brunswick Gardens. There, the aim was no longer simply to demonstrate a method. She had to adapt it to a particular child, parent, setting, and household. On the 20th of November, her family placement report noted strengths in cleanliness, temper, and tact. Her general capability had risen by one category, from good to very good. On the 7th of December, 1893, Christine Tisdall was certified as a Norland nurse. The act changed more than her title. She could walk into the next house carrying 9 months of observations made by people other than the household prepared to hire her. 2 books now carried different parts of that standing. The central black register proved that Christine had entered and completed the Institute's course. Her own slim testimonial volume traveled with her, collecting reports from training, hospital, and family employment. If the portable book was lost or challenged, another entry remained behind at Norland. The testimonial book warned that its certificate was neither complete nor final. Employers were asked to record new virtues and not merely repeat old faults. That caution protected the record from becoming a permanent sentence. The page could follow the worker, but it was supposed to keep moving with her. Norland also printed 11 rules for employers. A trained nurse was not to eat with the other servants, and she was not to take meals in a nursery bedroom. She was not to scrub floors, clean grates, or carry coal. The family was asked to pay her salary regularly, cover the laundry and the journey to begin work, allow daily exercise and Sunday worship, and provide a month of holiday at the employer's convenience. The instructions show how easily the new role could slide back into general chores. A family that hired a woman to care for a child could still notice an unclean grate, an empty coal scuttle, or a servant absent from the dining hall. Norland tried to define the nurse's remit before the front entrance closed behind her. The title was part of the distinction. Households were instructed to address the graduate as nurse, followed, if they wished, by her first name or surname. The instruction did not give her the family's rank. It gave her a role that could be named without reducing her to an informal nursery attachment. Christine's first work entry covered a single month as holiday relief. Later employers kept her longer. In Edinburgh in 1895, one family admitted that hiring a Norland nurse had felt like an experiment. They had wondered whether a woman could perform a servant's duties with the bearing of a lady without creating friction elsewhere in the household. The reference recorded that Christine had made the arrangement work. In Worcester, a little boy became seriously ill twice in 1 year. Christine cared for him through both episodes. Her final surviving employer report, dated August 1901, credited her with gaining the confidence of the doctors. A phrase in a family letter could now be read beside her hospital marks, her training reports, and the earlier judgments she had outgrown. Lehzen had left with Victoria's affection. Everest had left with Winston's protest. Bill had left Wood Farm with John's portrait. Christine could leave a house with a document that named what she had done there. The document did not guarantee a happy career. The first black book preserved failures with the same ink as successes. A red line crossed through students who were dismissed, withdrew, changed occupations, became ill, or died. Among the first 18 registrations, 3 women were dismissed. Others left for hospital work, nursing, secretarial employment, marriage, or health. Ward had created a record that could defend a trained carer, and she had also created one that could judge her. That was the price of moving nursery care from personal impression toward a profession. A family could no longer say anything it pleased without another history existing, but the institution could still decide that a probationer had failed. Demand grew quickly. By 1893, the institute counted 46 members. Newspaper cuttings in Ward's notebook reported that the new school had arrived and meant to stay. Employers who had once hesitated began asking for graduates. The problem shifted from proving that the occupation existed to deciding who could afford to enter it. The £36 fee rose as the curriculum expanded. A young woman with ability, but little money, could see a respected occupation forming behind a door she could not pay to open. In 1897, Norland nurse Maud Seppings persuaded graduates to contribute to a foundation fund. Their money provided a grant for 1 probationer in each cohort. The fee bought more than a single set of lectures. By 1903, the expanded course stood at £66 and joined institutional training to hospital and family placements. The candidate also needed the clothes and enough funds to remain away from other earnings until completion. Even a reduced fee could leave a woman unable to stop earning elsewhere long enough to qualify. The graduates were financing the next carers standing. That made the new identity more than a provision sold to wealthy parents. Women already inside the profession were deciding that access to it should not belong entirely to women whose families could afford entry. A single grant did not solve the fee. By the turn of the century, the cost had reached £80. Principal Isabel Sharman introduced another route in 1904. 4 young women each year could enter as maidens, complete a year of light household chores inside Norland, then train for a reduced fee of £12. The solution recreated the very line the Institute claimed it could cross. A maiden opened entrances, served meals, and handled chores in domestic quarters, while future nurses studied. Norland insisted she occupied the same social position as the paying students, but gave her a different uniform and a separate dormitory so everyone could identify which woman was assisting. The contradiction was not hidden. Sharman wrote to the students before the first maidens arrived and told them the experiment would depend on how the whole institute treated the women doing the work. The title maiden was chosen to distinguish them from servants. Their labor still looked like service from the other side of the breakfast table. Alice Gibbs entered through that route in 1916. Her day began at 6 in the morning in the basement of number 10 Pembridge Square. She cleaned a large Eagle cooking range, prepared breakfast for the probationers and students by 7, laid and lit 2 more fires, and scrubbed the kitchen table. For the year as a maiden, Alice surrendered even her first name. Maidens were addressed as Honor, Verity, Prudence, or Mercy, so their given identity could be set aside when they later became students. Alice was Honor. The device was meant to preserve equality in the future. In practice, it made the hierarchy audible whenever anyone addressed a woman across the hall. Alice completed the year and entered training. In her first post, she earned £2 and 10 shillings a month. As a result, the scheme had carried her from unpaid service into a named occupation with wages. More than half a century later, at the age of 75, she wrote back to Norland about the range, the fires, the name Honor, and the pride that had followed her through life. The worker had kept her own account of the bargain. Other maidens stayed in the occupation for decades. Dorothy Badham entered as a maiden in 1917 and took her first Norland post 2 years later. By 1969, she had served the same family for 50 years and was caring for its 3rd generation. The record could preserve loyalty without pretending that loyalty removed the employer's power. Emily Ward kept pushing on the other side of the contract. Her copy of Froebel's book treated the child as a developing individual, not a small body to be kept quiet until school. Corporal punishment was prohibited from Norland's beginning. Training connected hygiene and illness to songs, stories, movement, observation, and handwork, because a nurse was expected to shape the whole nursery day. Ward argued that affection alone was insufficient. A woman could love a child and still misunderstand what the child needed. Training was meant to make care conscious, to give the nurse a reason for an activity, a way to notice change, and a standard she could use when a household habit conflicted with the child's welfare. She applied the same ideas with her adopted daughter. The book on her shelf connected 3 rooms: Victorian life separated, the teacher's classroom, the mother's home, and the servant's nursery. Ward's claim was that the child experienced all 3 as education. The adult social label did not change what the child learned from her. That standard altered the nursery setting. A nurse taught that enforced discipline had limited value, could meet a parent who expected immediate obedience through fear. Norland did not give the carer legal authority over the parent. It gave her a principle, a vocabulary, and an institution behind her when she chose another method. The uniform strengthened that backing and created new dangers. By 1902, a Speedwell badge marked graduates with sustained employment. Fully qualified nurses, probationers, and newly qualified nurses had to be distinguishable. Competing schools copied the look, and imposters appeared in Norland style. Surplus uniforms had to be returned, and unofficial sale became a disciplinary offense. Helen Brooks' career shows how far that promise could move. She trained at Norland between 1911 and 1912, then worked for 28 years as a health visitor in the Child Welfare Department at University College Hospital. Long service earned her a badge, then silver and blue bars. In 1943, at Norland's wartime headquarters, the Duchess of Kent presented her with the Green Bar for 21 years of service. A dress that once separated a trained nurse from a housemaid had become valuable enough to counterfeit. Norland protected the cloth because employers were beginning to read it as a promise. The individual worker's reputation and the institution's reputation now traveled together. Brooke had entered through nursery training and built a career in public child welfare. The badge did not commemorate one family's affection. It marked experience that could be counted across households and institutions, decades after the child in her first nursery had grown. Ward did not remain in an office while others carried the system. Founding staff member Mildred Hastings later remembered her at the Institute each day, lecturing, inspecting departments, working out menus in the kitchen, and criticizing the cookery. The founder moved between educational theory and the food a child would actually be served. By 1911, Ward could stand at a badge ceremony and describe nursery work as educational rather than merely domestic. The first 5 names had become a network of trained women and employment records. Then a war tested whether that identity belonged only inside wealthy houses. In August 1914, European families began fleeing invasion and battle. Ward offered the farmhouse on her Little Hallards estate in Sussex to a committee arranging shelter for Belgian refugees. The committee rejected the offer. She sent an influential representative to petition it directly. The decision changed, and refugee families entered the property. The new arrivals were weakened by flight. After 3 days, one boy developed scarlet fever. The infection moved through the children. Norland students were told to care for them while the disease spread inside a house that had been offered as safety. Their training in hygiene and signs of illness had left the classroom and become the difference between a principle and a response. Every child recovered. Ward then helped women among the refugees find paid domestic placements with local families. Shelter answered the immediate danger. Income gave the women a way to begin acting beyond it. At the Institute in London, workrooms that had produced uniforms began making baby clothes for destitute families and refugees. Norlanders donated to Belgian Relief, the Red Cross, and beds for wounded soldiers. The school founded to move women into a defined occupation now had to decide what that occupation meant when ordinary employment collapsed. Some nurses lost their posts because families could no longer afford them. Others left continental households when travel became dangerous. Probationers interrupted training for factories, agriculture, canteens, hospitals, and the Voluntary Aid Detachment. A certificate built for the nursery began opening other rooms. Norland's surviving Great War testimonial books place individual names and decisions inside that wider dispersal. Mabel Lister's testimonial books contained more than 50 references across her career. During the first part of the war, she took 5 short family posts in 2 years, including 2 weeks with a child newly arrived from India and struggling with the change. In 1915, she paused nursery care and joined the Voluntary Aid Detachment. For 2 years, Mabel cared for injured soldiers in 2 hospitals and received a Red Cross certificate. She later cared for her own sister. Her testimonial book did not break when the child left the page. It absorbed new work and showed that the training could follow her into another emergency. Emma Holland made a similar decision earlier. She had trained as a nurse before becoming a nursery nurse and had volunteered part-time with the detachment since 1909. When war began, she moved into surgical work and later a convalescent home for soldiers. The change did not erase her Norland history. It explained why she could be trusted with the next task. For nurses still on the continent, leaving could mean abandoning a child during the moment of greatest risk. Grace Taylor was in Brussels with the Countess de Borchgrave. She brought her charge to England and cared for the child in her London home until a safe return became possible. Family, nursery, and national border had all moved. The responsibility recorded beside Grace's name continued. Marion Burgess faced the most dangerous extension of that duty. She worked for Grand Duchess Kirill of Russia and fled with the family and 3 children as revolution and exile overtook the household. Years passed without a holiday. When an opportunity to leave came in 1918, she stayed because the family remained in danger. In 1920, influenza entered the reduced household. Marion nursed the children until they recovered, then died after catching the illness herself. Her obituary in the Norland Quarterly carried the consequence back to the women who understood what her training record meant. The household was not the sole author of the final line. The war also threatened the institution that kept those lines. Applications fell as women entered emergency roles. Norland gave up its social club. Walter Ward lent funds to keep teaching and the children's nurseries operating. The school survived because a reputation built through hundreds of individual books could outlast a year with fewer fees. At Christmas in 1914, the Institute warned that nurses were losing situations for reasons beyond their authority. Continental posts had closed, British households were cutting staff, and training fees were falling. At the same moment, demands for care grew. Norland's club at number 7, Pembridge Square, was surrendered. The social salon disappeared so the classrooms could remain. Even during the disruption, the Institute's records carried roughly 700 active nurses and students in an average year. The number did not mean every woman was safely employed. It meant the occupation had become large enough for a nurse, dismissed by one wartime household, to remain part of a network that knew she existed. Emily Ward's notebook kept receiving dates through the conflict. Its cuttings, lists, and documents ran to the 6th of November, 1919. The object that began before the first 5 probationers entered now contained 27 years of decisions. It had become the backstage record of how an occupation was made. Ward continued to argue that each generation required nurses prepared for the world children would inherit. She did not freeze the training in 1892. Hospital work, uniforms, financial aid, employment rules, and the curriculum changed as pressure exposed weaknesses. Only later did the uniform record reveal a wartime pressure around Emily Ward. As a result, a more practical coat appeared in 1919. Wool scarcity had delayed the replacement. The material changed, but the point of being recognizable remained. The black books continued as well. They held first employers, dates, fees, withdrawals, dismissals, qualifications, and careers. A red line could still close an entry. The existence of the line was proof that the worker's history now lived somewhere outside the house that employed her. Emily Ward died on the 15th of June, 1930. Mildred Hastings remembered not an abstract reformer, but a woman moving through the institute, checking menus, teaching, and inspecting each department. Ward could be removed by death from the quarters she had organized. The books did not stop recording. Years later, her name survives in the register she began. New cohorts continued to place their names in the black books. At the annual Founders' Day ceremony, students signed the register, and 3 candles were lit. One for Emily Ward, one for the first principal Isabel Sharman, and one for all Norlanders. Completion dates and qualifications later joined the original signature. The book made entry into the occupation a witnessed act, then waited for the worker to return with the next change in her status. 12 volumes eventually carried the registrations of every student admitted since 1892. The format changed as qualifications changed, but the sequence remained recognizable. A person entered, trained, completed or withdrew, and left a trace that another household could not silently erase. Her own notebook almost disappeared anyway. For decades, the black leather volume sat among Norland's papers without being recognized for what it was. During a hurried move from Denford Park to Bath in 2003, Elizabeth Harvey was packing the library. A stack of worn books seemed unlikely to belong in the new building. Harvey took the boxes home rather than let them be discarded. Nearly 15 years passed. During a clear-out in 2017, she opened one of the old volumes. The first page carried handwriting and the date 1892. Invitations, press cuttings, associates, prospective employers, and the first plans followed. Harvey packaged the book and carried it back to the college. The diary had been missing in plain sight for almost a century. Once identified, it restored Ward's own sequence of action. The Institute had preserved thousands of judgments about nurses. The recovered notebook preserved the founder's uncertainty, lobbying, rejected plan, waiting clients, and choices before success made the outcome look inevitable. That recovery changes the 4 nursery stories behind it. Lehzen's departure survives mainly through Victoria's journals and letters. Everest's dismissal survives through the Churchill papers. Bill's final night appears in Queen Mary's diary and the royal collection. The women are visible because the households around them kept records. Emily Ward tried to give the worker a record that did not begin and end with the family. Christine Tisdall could carry 9 months of observation into an employer's house and carry that employer's report out again. Alice Gibbs could write back in her own old age. Mabel Lister's book could cross from nursery posts into wartime hospitals. Marion Burgess's death could be entered by the occupation that claimed her. The change did not make the nanny equal to the parent, the queen, or the employer. A family could still dismiss her. A school could still draw a red line through her name. Fees, class rules, uniforms, and references created new forms of judgment beside the old ones. But the departure was no longer the only document. At Wood Farm, Charlotte Bill had lifted a telephone because the child in her care would not wake. The Queen wrote down the nurse's heartbreak. At Windsor, Louise Lehzen returned keys that could not travel with her. Elizabeth Everest received a dismissal letter she did not control. At number 9 Norland Place, 5 women wrote their names into a black book. The nursery door could still close, but the record now left with the woman.